All right, so I'd like to introduce Jeff Green, who on very short notice was willing to join us. He is a part of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and I'm only just learning about this group. I attended a meeting of theirs this week, and I'm very excited about all the work they're doing. So I'll let him tell you more about himself and about his organization and the work that they're doing and how we can get involved. So go ahead, Jeff. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, all. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to talk to you guys this morning about issues that is very important and very dear to my heart, which is climate change and the climate emergency that we now face. So I'm going to share my desktop, and then I will talk through a presentation that I have.
Wonderful. Molly. Hi, Molly. We're just getting started. Is it working, Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think I have it set so that you can share your screen, but let me know if it doesn't.
All right. Can people see the slide there that says why an invisible gas needs a visible price?
No, we can't.
Okay. Let me.
It doesn't look like anything you've shared yet. Ah, there we go.
Okay.
Beautiful. And so people who are watching, you'll have a gallery that pops up on the right if you're on a computer that has people's pictures. You have options. You can like move that gallery around by clicking on the black bar across the top. You can move it around so that you can see things on the slide, or you can even make it smaller. You have little icons where you can hide the videos or only show the person who's speaking. There are options up there that you can do your preference if you would like.
And I would like to recommend not looking at me. That's the least interesting part of this. So just make the presentation as large as you like.
You can do hide the thumbnail video then, and then you'll just see the presentation.
Right. So, okay, I'm Jeff Green. I'm a member of the Evanston chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and I'm here today to talk about the climate crisis and why a major part of the solution to that crisis lies in putting a price on carbon dioxide. So here's some information about Citizens Climate Lobby. CCL is a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots organization. We have about 180,000 volunteers in nearly 500 US chapters. And the aim of the organization is to help us avoid catastrophic climate change by lobbying and working with Congress to pass carbon fee and dividend legislation. And I'm going to get into what that is in more detail as we proceed. So let's start out with some basic facts here. Why does CO2 matter? This is a graph of the relationship between atmospheric CO2 from the burning of coal, oil, and gas and average global temperatures. And it's not a coincidence that temperature is moving right along in lockstep with the increases in greenhouse gases from fossil fuels. CO2 accounts for around 3/4 of the warming impact of current human greenhouse gas emissions, and 87% of all human-produced CO2 emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels. Now, scientists have known since the 1800s that CO2 traps atmospheric heat and raises global temperatures. So there's nothing new here. And more than half of all industrial emissions of CO2 since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution have been released since 1988, only 32 years ago. So half of that CO2 is been put in the atmosphere well within the lifetimes of most of us here on the call. And that is a measure of the disaster, but also kind of a beacon of hope, since if it went in that quickly, perhaps we can act quickly enough to do something about it. Now, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 is now past 400 parts per million, and that's a level that last occurred about 3 million years ago. And at that time, the world was about 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it is now, and sea levels were 32 to 65 feet higher than they are now. And that's a world that humans have no experience with at all. Continued growth in CO2 emissions over this century and beyond would lead to an atmospheric CO2 concentration not present on Earth for tens to hundreds of millions of years.
What was the temperature in that slide? It was saying correlated with temperature, but the temperatures listed were like 1 degrees. What is that the temperature of?
This is the increase in temperature. Okay, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree centigrade.
So it's like the increase in like average temperature on like what?
Yes, average global temperature.
The increase in average global temperature each year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and again, that may not seem like a lot, but it is very, very significant as far as the effects on Earth's ecosystems. And also keep in mind that average temperature is just that. And there are parts of the Earth, such as the Arctic, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, where the increases are much more significant than that 1 degree centigrade or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So climate change is not a future event. We can see the effects of climate change in our daily lives, and CO2-driven climate change results in more frequent severe weather, melting ice caps, and rising sea levels, higher extinction rates, and harmful effects on human health. America is now under siege by climate change in ways that scientists have warned about for years. But there is a second part to this warning, and that decades of growing crisis are already locked into the global ecosystem and cannot be reversed. And that's something that we all need to keep in mind. We've begun a journey down a road, and we're locked into that journey. There are aspects of that we can't change. And the impacts of climate change are not evenly distributed. Those who have the smallest carbon footprints, poor and working class people, people of color, citizens of developing countries, they suffer the most. Now, in the Midwest, extreme heat, heavy downpours, and flooding have affected infrastructure, health, agriculture, transportation, air and water quality, and more. And climate change will also increase risks to the Great Lakes, which make up about 20% of all the surface fresh water on Earth. In Chicago, city beaches and parks are disappearing under record high water levels, and storms have pushed 12-foot waves onto Lakeshore Drive. And last November, the Chicago Department of Transportation and the Park District initiated an emergency shoreline protection project on beaches in Chicago to protect them from erosion that's occurring from the increased levels in the lake. On the West Coast, climate change both magnifies the intensity of rainfall and increases the likelihood of periods of extreme dryness and drought, resulting in more frequent and more intense wildfires. Now, wildfires have always been an element of California's ecosystems, but over the past century, the state has warmed by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 times more than the global average. And this hotter air draws more water out of the plants and the soil than cooler air, leaving the trees, shrubs, and rolling grasslands of the state dry and ready to burn. And new research reveals that the Southwest in general has now experienced a human-caused mega drought more severe than any drought that has occurred in the last 1,200 years. One scientist said recently, don't think of 2020 as the warmest month of August in California in the last century. Think of it as one of the coolest months of August in California in the next century. And these fires are occurring worldwide. In 2019, Australia became ground zero for the climate catastrophe as fires burned about 43,000 square miles, an area 3/4 the size of Illinois. And it's more than triple the area destroyed by those 2018 fires in California and 6 times the size of the 2019 fires in the Amazon. And after this year, of course, we'll have to update the California fires to reflect what's going on right now. Scientists estimate that close to 3 billion native Australian animals were killed or displaced by those fires, and fear that some of those species of animals and plants may have been wiped out completely. And researchers looked at the historical record and found nothing approaching those Australian wildfires anywhere across the globe. So as I mentioned, the impacts of climate change are not evenly distributed. In the US, counties with large African-American populations are exposed to extreme temperatures more days per year than counties with smaller African-American populations. Looking beyond the US this year, rains left 1/4 of Bangladesh underwater, washing away the few things that count as assets for some of the world's poorest people. There's a UN report that says climate change will have devastating consequences for people in poverty. Hundreds of millions will face food insecurity, forced migration, disease, and death. And think about the effects on political stability caused by migration of 1 million people or less in Europe. And now think about the effects on political stability of migrations of 100 million people, 200 million people, whose current habitats might no longer be able to support human life. I did a little research and I found an ELCA publication, Let's Talk Faith and Climate, which emphasizes that climate change is having and will continue to have profound effects, from injury and illness to displacement and destruction on people across the globe. The most vulnerable among us are being harmed first and worst. So 2016 was the warmest year ever recorded, and we just ended the warmest decade in history. And that trend is continuing. January 2020 was the warmest January since we began keeping records. February was the second warmest February. March was the second warmest March. May was the hottest May ever, and it goes on. Now on the map, the darker the color, the greater the divergence from average temperatures of the mid-20th century. And you can see that the darkest areas are in the Arctic, so let's focus on that part of the Earth for a minute. The Greenland ice sheet is melting rapidly. It lost 3.8 trillion tons of ice between 1992 and 2018. And the red line on this graph shows that last year the melting of Greenland's ice cap reached unprecedented levels. In fact, the losses of the Greenland ice sheet reached a record last year, more than 530 gigatons, 530 billion tons of ice melted. And the island is currently the biggest contributor to global sea levels. If the entire ice cap were to melt, world sea levels would rise by about 23 feet, submerging many coastal cities. So I mentioned in the title of the slide, a melting tipping point. So what's a tipping point? If there's any Jenga players here, you know what happens when you take out that one wrong piece. Okay, that's a tipping point. It's where, due to something you've done, you kick off a chain of events that you can't reverse or stop. It's a point of no return. And the tipping point for Greenland is the point at which the increase in temperature will result in the irreversible melting of its ice cap. And according to a recent study, that tipping point may have been reached. The new study concludes that the widespread retreat of the Greenland ice sheet between 2000 and 2005 resulted in an increase in discharge and a switch to a new dynamic state of sustained ice loss that will persist. So if that is correct, that means we've begun the process of losing that ice sheet and increasing sea levels over an extended period of time. We're talking centuries, but a sea level rise of up to 23, 24 feet. And the Arctic ice cap is now 40% smaller today than it was in 1979. And this illustrates a process that's related to tipping points, which is feedback loops. So what happens with a feedback loop and in the Arctic is, as the sea ice melts, it exposes more water. Water, being darker than the ice, absorbs more heat, which increases the water temperature, which melts more ice, which causes the cycle to repeat and intensify. The 2012 sea ice minimum was the lowest on record, and the 2020 sea ice minimum put us 969,000 square miles below the 1981 to 2010 average seasonal low. So the ice that covered the Arctic in 2019 or 2020, at its minimum, we lost an area equal to the size of Alaska, Texas, and Montana combined. And scientists recently reported that the effects of global warming in the Arctic are so severe that the region is shifting to a different climate, one characterized less by ice and snow and more by open water and rain. And if global temperatures keep rising at their current pace, the transformation to an unrecognizable climate system could be complete before the end of this century. So we're talking about a different Arctic than we have ever experienced. It's going to be an Arctic with a different climate than we've seen before. Now, there's another feedback loop that's occurring in the Arctic, and that involves the thawing of the permafrost, which is soil that has been frozen for years, perhaps centuries, perhaps thousands of years. But warming is causing that permafrost to thaw, and that's releasing CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, which also causes another feedback loop of permafrost thawing, increased emissions from the permafrost, increased temperatures from the emissions, and more permafrost thawing. And there's a huge amount of carbon stored in permafrost. Right now, the Earth's atmosphere contains about 850 billion tons of carbon. And scientists estimate that there are about 1,400 billion tons of carbon frozen in the permafrost. And that release will make it much more difficult for us to control increases in global temperatures. So where's the carbon coming from? And if you look at the carbon footprint of various nations, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. If you look at total CO2 emissions, which are the blue bars, China leads the world and we're in second place. If you look at per capita emissions, which means total emissions divided by population, which is the red line, Saudi Arabia and Australia are first and second, with the United States coming in third. So that has led some people to argue that we shouldn't be handicapping our economy by putting financial resources into cutting greenhouse gases when other countries are bigger emitters. So let's look at that from a third perspective. Now here's a graph of cumulative CO2 emissions going back all the way to 1820. And what it shows is the nation with the biggest overall cumulative carbon footprint is the United States. And that kind of gives us a moral obligation to take the lead in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a panel, a UN panel called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And that's the UN's body for assessing the science related to global warming. And it says we need aggressive solutions immediately because we have only about a decade to cut our emissions in half if we're to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And the report emphasizes that putting a price on carbon is critical to reducing emissions. Now there's a US report called the National Climate Assessment, and the fourth version of that was released recently. And it makes these points. It says human activities are the only realistic explanation for climate change, and our effect on the Earth's ecosystems is unprecedented. It says that we've entered new territory in terms of the atmospheric levels of CO2. And that's referring to this concentration that hasn't existed for 3 million years. It says that it's likely that global average sea levels will rise 1 to 4 feet by the end of this century, and they could rise as much as 8 feet. And it makes a point that there is significant potential for humanity's effect on the planet to result in abrupt and irreversible surprises, and that the further and faster the Earth's ecosystems are pushed towards warming, the greater the risk of such surprises. So these surprises are unanticipated events. We don't know what will happen. We don't know about the interrelationship between temperature and various other aspects of our ecosystems. This is all new. And so we can be surprised by things that happened, and probably not in a good way. So there's no argument among scientists about climate change. 97% of climate scientists agree that global warming is real, it's caused by greenhouse gases, and we're causing all or almost all of the increase. And last November, over 11,000 scientists signed and published a letter warning of the climate emergency. So among scientists, there's no longer a debate. Okay, so here's some good news. And this is something that Citizens Climate Lobby is very active in supporting. There's a bill in the House of Representatives that puts a price on carbon dioxide. The bill's rationale is when something becomes more expensive, people buy less of it. Okay, so what is the Energy Innovation Act and how does it work? The act does 3 things. Okay, it puts a price on fossil fuel products, and the producers of those products pay those costs. The second thing is that the act returns to US citizens all the net proceeds collected from fossil fuel companies. And finally, the act mandates border adjustments, which I'll explain in a minute. So let's take a second to just talk about the basic principle. Why should we add a carbon fee to fossil fuel products? And this involves a concept from economics called externalities. Okay, so explained pretty simply, when you produce something and the price doesn't include all the real costs, somebody still has to pay those costs. And those additional costs are called externalities, and fossil fuels are loaded with them. So here's why. I'm sure some of you have dogs, and we all know how wonderful dogs are. They're loving, loyal, playful, they're great. But what else do? They poop. And what do? You clean up after your dog, because who wants all that poop laying around? So what do fossil fuel producers do? They provide us with heat, light, gas for our cars. Those are positives. But what else do? They pollute, and they're warming the planet to dangerous levels with CO2 emissions. And they're not really cleaning up after themselves. They leave that to the rest of us in terms of cleaning up waste sites, fighting global warming, dealing with health issues caused by extreme heat. There are a lot of things that are not included in the cost of fossil fuels. So the Act makes these producers pay for their own mess by charging them for the real costs of producing and using fossil fuels, including the atmospheric warming caused by the fuel's emissions. Now, the Energy Innovation Act gradually assigns these actual costs on others of CO2, which are the externalities, assigning those costs where they belong, to fossil fuel producers. And in the bill, the costs start at $15 per metric ton of carbon and rise by $10 a ton each year. As the cost of fossil fuels increases, people will buy less of them and switch to lower cost, lower CO2 alternatives. And businesses that are considering long-term investments can plan for those predictably increasing costs and thereby reducing the uncertainty on their planning. Now, all remittances from the Treasury to the Treasury from fossil fuel producers are distributed equally to US citizens each month. The higher fossil fuel costs for consumers resulting from the addition of the cost of carbon are reduced by the dividends. Okay, so what's this graph about? This graph models the impact of the Act on US households in the first year of implementation, broken out by what they call consumption quintiles, which maps very closely to income levels. If you have a lower income or consumption, you actually make a profit from the dividends. That's what this bar here that shows 96% of people in the lowest income quintile, which is just a fifth, okay, benefit from the policy. If you're rich, you pay out more than you get in dividends. Okay, but so you can look at it this way. If this is your house, you get more in dividends than you pay in increased fossil fuel costs. And if this is your house, you pay more in fossil fuel costs than you receive in dividends. So I think that the Act treats people fairly. Lower income consumers have a net gain since they buy smaller quantities of fossil fuel related products and have smaller carbon footprints. High income consumers have a net loss, but they also have bigger and perhaps multiple homes and cars, fly more, and have larger carbon footprints. So finally, and this is point 3 that I mentioned before, what does the Act do to ensure US businesses are competitive with foreign companies whose prices don't reflect the real costs of their carbon emissions? So the Act addresses this by specifying an import adjustment, an export adjustment, and a border tax. So if you're importing, if you're a foreign company sending fossil fuel products to the United States, the Act adds an import fee to your prices, which levels the playing field for US companies. If you're a US company sending fossil fuel products abroad, the Act refunds to you the carbon cost adjustment added to your products, allowing you to reduce your export prices. And if you're a US company trying to dodge carbon pricing by relocating overseas, the Act includes import fees that adjust for the cost of carbon if you try to bring your products back here. Okay, so the main takeaway from all this is that the Act protects US jobs and businesses from unfair foreign competition. Okay, so who is it that actually supports this idea of carbon pricing? Well, economists do. The Wall Street Journal published a letter supporting carbon pricing signed by over 3,500 economists, including every former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors since the 70s, and 4 former Fed chairs. Businesses, these and many more, have come out in support of putting a price on carbon. Okay, the US Conference of Mayors voted to support carbon pricing. 100 state and local governments, including the city of Chicago, have passed resolutions calling for a carbon fee and dividend policy in the US. Pope Francis supports carbon pricing. He said that carbon pricing is essential to stem global warming. And I took a little time to look over his 2015 encyclical letter, and it goes into just incredible detail on a very sophisticated level on the perils of climate change and on the issues of climate and environmental justice. Now, the Energy Innovation Act that I'm talking about, it's also, House Resolution 763 is its numerical name, has broad legislative support. There's 83 sponsors and co-sponsors in the House, and 5 of them are from Illinois. In polling done, voters have supported a price on carbon, and this shows carbon pricing support by all voters, by party, and by liberals and conservatives. And voters support a fee and dividend policy. Here's a graph of fee and dividend support broken out the same way. And just to emphasize, fee and dividend means the fee is the price that is assigned to fossil fuel producers that they have to pay. And the dividend is the money that is sent back to every US citizen every month by the Treasury from those fees that are paid by the fossil fuel companies. Now here's a look at what the Energy Innovation Act is projected to do. So that cone-shaped area in the middle of the graph there represents the top and bottom of the IPCC's range of target temperature increases that we need to hit to avoid the worst consequences of global warming. So the top of that cone is 2 degrees centigrade, the bottom of the cone is 1.5, and that border in the middle of the cone where the green shaded area meets the blue shaded area represents the effects of implementation of the Energy Innovation Act. And as you can see, it's projected to drive carbon dioxide down right into the middle of that range that the IPCC wants all nations to hit. So it doesn't do everything. Other things need to be done, but it gets us a significant portion of the way there in terms of meeting our goal of reducing carbon emissions. So to sum up, the act it's effective in reducing CO2. It's good for the economy because one thing that I haven't mentioned is the jobs that it will create in clean energy as people move off of fossil fuels and the demand for clean energy increases. It's good for people in terms of, obviously, the impact on global warming and on people's health. It's a bipartisan bill, it's market-oriented, and it's revenue neutral in that all the money that's collected gets given back to the people. So the next steps for the bill are getting more sponsors for the House bill, and it may have to be reintroduced in the next session of Congress. There needs to be a companion bill introduced in the Senate. Both of those bills need to move through committees. They need to go to a reconciliation committee between the House and Senate, and then finally it needs to be signed into law. So that's on the federal level. What can the rest of us do? Here's something that is coming up right away. This Tuesday evening at 7:30 at the new Trier Township annual meeting, one of the items on the agenda is an item to put this question on the April ballot. Shall the U.S. Congress pass legislation to place a carbon fee on fossil fuel producers, where the collected revenue is given equitably to American households, incentivizing businesses and consumers to reduce climate disrupting emissions, transition to clean energy, and protect our well-being? So I can provide the links to that meeting to the pastor for distribution to everybody, and you are all welcome and more than welcome to attend that meeting. It's a Zoom meeting, and speak in favor of putting this question on the ballot. And it doesn't even mean that you are personally in favor of every item in the question, but it's just that you're in favor of putting it on the ballot and letting people in the township speak to it. There's other ways to get involved. You can join our Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm in the Evanston chapter. There's weekly meetings of CCL. You can start a petition for your municipality to endorse the act, and you can write and send emails to the people in Congress and your senators. And CCL makes it easy to do that. We have a website where you can generate emails to Jan Schakowsky, for example, who is a co-sponsor, and to Senators Duckworth and Durbin. So keep this in mind, that the Earth's climate is changing. That's a decision that's already made. We've destabilized the planetary ecosystems that have nurtured the development of human civilization. The climate since the end of the last ice age has been relatively stable, and that's not the case anymore. We've destabilized that relationship. And we may not be able to reverse the changes, but our actions will have a huge influence on the magnitude of those changes and the impacts on humanity and on the planet on which we live. So, thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Jeff. That was packed with all kinds of information. Makes me want to actually read a little bit more about some of these things and maybe look at those slides again.
Sure.
We have a few minutes before noon. I'm wondering what questions people have for Jeff about his presentation, or about the new Trier meeting on Tuesday, or about the bill. What questions do we have?
My question would be, what kind of opposition is there to the bill, and where's it coming from?
Awesome question.
Opposition from the bill is coming somewhat predictably from Republicans who have made climate change and global warming a kind of a hot button issue, a defining issue. And it's also, of course, coming from the fossil fuel industry itself, which does not obviously want to risk reducing its profits by supporting the diminution of the use of fossil fuel products. Now, some companies, such as BP, have actually come out and been quite forthright now about their desire to move away from fossil fuels and become more of an electric company. So BP is one oil company that seems to have finally admitted that it sees the light and is moving in that direction. Others have not. So opposition to the bill is coming mainly from Republicans and from the fossil fuel industry, who actually is a big contributor to Republican candidates and politicians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That makes sense. And I mean, this bill would create drastic change, it seems. You know, it would, I mean, I imagine it'd be very bad for the companies that are, you know, using a ton of fossil fuels. I imagine, or maybe it wouldn't, because
Well, it would force them to change. It would introduce new competitors into the energy marketplace.
Okay. So
And
they could maybe have the potential to change. Because I'm also thinking it could lead to layoffs and all that kind of stuff, which I don't think, like, I think we still need to do it anyway. And like the economy will have to adjust and like find different ways to employ people. But
yeah, and it can adjust by employing people in the renewable industry, which is
right.
really generating a lot of jobs right now.
Mm-hmm.
How is this meeting that is being held on Tuesday looked at as far as its support or rejection of the vote?
Well, I think any grassroots support that is demonstrated has an impact on politicians, because if there's one thing we know they attend to, it's voter sentiment in their districts. Now, I mean, Jan Schakowsky has been a leader in terms of her legislation and her stand on climate change issues, and she supports this bill.
But she does not represent New Trier Township, does she?
Parts of it, I believe so. Who is it, Brad Schneider, that supports the rest?
Yeah, I think probably Brad.
Yeah. So Brad is not a sponsor, and for him to see support among his constituency would be a very powerful prod, because I know my group has spoken to Brad, and he is, somewhat reticent because his district has gone back and forth between Republican and Democrat. So I think he probably feels more vulnerable than Jan does. But I think, an outpouring of support for a bill like this from his constituents would make a big difference in how he feels about it and whether or not he would consider becoming a co-sponsor.
Yeah, I think that you have to put the pressure where it will do some good. I live in Evanston. I rarely do anything with Jan because I pretty much know. I mean, I take her for granted, which a lot of us do, which maybe we shouldn't, but we do.
Well, one thing you can do is you can send an email to Jan, and I'll send the link. I'll send this presentation, a copy of it, to Allison, and she can pass that on so that you can generate a letter to Jan thanking her for her support.
Yeah, right.
If we live in Evanston, there's really no benefit to us going to the New Trier meeting, right? Since we're not in that township, we're not really a constituent.
There's no benefit in terms of actual voting, but in terms of moral support, you can, if we're on a screen like this, you can certainly clap and cheer for anyone that speaks in favor of the question.
Okay.
My understanding is that you don't have to live in New Trier Township to speak.
Okay.
Is that
Right.
inaccurate? That's what I was told.
Yeah, and
So,
I
so basically, like, if basically on Tuesday they're going to be talking about whether they even want to put this question on the ballot.
exactly.
So if you live in Evanston, if they decide yes to put it on the ballot, it's not your ballot. It's not the ballot you're going to see. But if you live in Evanston, you can still come to the meeting on Tuesday and say, I think we should do it. You don't have to live in New Trier Township to voice an opinion, and your opinion's even strengthened if you talk about your stake in the New Trier Township community. I go to these businesses in Wilmette, and I go there for church, and I you still have a stake in the New Trier community. So you do not have to live in New Trier to speak in favor of putting this question on the ballot.
Okay.
How are these contacts for Tuesday meeting going to be available to us? Is that through something that St. John's is going to put on their website, or?
It was already in the e-newsletter on Friday. So on Friday, there was an announcement in the announcement sections of the e-newsletter. There was a whole announcement about this Tuesday meeting. And so it has the Zoom link for the meeting on that announcement in our e-newsletter.
Okay,
You
great.
can just click on that link on Tuesday night. This won't be the first item on the agenda, but it will be, so you probably don't need to be there right away. If you want to skip the first 20 minutes or half hour, you'll probably be fine. But it's also kind of interesting if you've never been to one of these meetings before. It's just kind of, it's enlightening to see what the business of the township is and what they're up to. So I've found it interesting to go to like village meetings and stuff to just start to learn. But yep, that link is already available. And when you're on the call, they should be able to tell you how you can go about making public comment. Usually for the village board meetings, you can make comment through the chat, or you can like have an opportunity to speak, unmute yourself and speak. I'm not sure what it'll be for New Trier Township. I've never been to one of their meetings. They only meet once a year, so.
Any
So
other
I'll be at
questions?
the meeting. I'll be there, and I would love to see other familiar faces on the call. And I hope to speak in favor of the bill.
That's great.
In favor of putting the summary, in favor of putting the question on the ballot is all we're speaking on. We're just like,
Right.
we think this question should be on the ballot. And the hope would be then if it's on the ballot, then we have an opportunity to do some advocacy this spring to let people know about this kind of issue and be like, hey, there's going to be this question on the ballot. Here's what it's talking about. Here's why this bill would be so great. Encourage people to vote yes on the ballot. So then if they vote yes on the ballot, then we can say to our legislators at the US Congress level, like, look, we have all this support in the North Shore area for this issue. And that like gives them more courage to be able to support the bill.
Yes, exactly.
And at a minimum, then we can do some consciousness raising.
Exactly. Just getting it on the ballot does consciousness raising, even if no matter how people end up voting. Yeah,
Right.
Exactly. So it can be a positive step, and it's neat because it connects to a whole, countrywide issue, but this is a super local thing at this meeting on Tuesday. So that's pretty fun to connect those two levels of government.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Jeff. And thank you everyone who stayed for the presentation. I hope to see some of you on the call on Tuesday, and let me know if you have questions or need help with getting on that call, and I can always reach out to Jeff if we have more questions for him.
Yes, and I'd be happy to give more talks to other groups in the congregation, or other groups that some of you may belong to that you think might be interested in hearing about this.
Great, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, Jeff.
you're very welcome.
All right, thanks everybody.
Okay.
Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.